Well, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this session. I am really pleased to welcome to this afternoon Gideon Lazar, who is going to be presenting to us. And so, Gideon, you have 30 minutes of presentation time. That leaves us about 15 minutes of question time, and I will try and give you a warning when you've got about 5 minutes left. If you have questions as we're going through, do feel free to put them into the chat, but we're a nice small group. So I'm hoping that will give us plenty of time for questions and dialogue at the end. So Gideon, thank you very much and welcome, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. So just to introduce this paper a bit, because I know it looks like a bit of an odd topic. There's been quite a bit, sort of this renaissance of neo-Aristotelianism in contemporary philosophy. And that includes within the philosophy of science. But something I've felt is that this neo-Aristotelian approach generally assumes a Thomistic approach to neo-Aristotelianism. And there's actually been a lot of other approaches to Aristotelianism throughout the history of philosophy. And I have a particular interest in this approach taken by the Franciscan tradition, most notably represented by the medieval philosopher John Duns Scotus. And so I presented actually at an earlier conference in this series as well, looking at quantum mechanics. And in this one, I want to try and look at thermodynamics and what insights we might get into thermodynamics by looking at it in light of the metaphysics of Scotus. So my paper is entitled, "Who Orders All Things Mightily, a Scotist Approach to the Metaphysics of Entropy." Lord our God, you have declared yourself to be the first and the last. Teach your servant to show by reason what he holds most certain by faith, that you are the first eminent, the most eminent, and the final end. In this prayer, the 14th century theologian, Blessed John Duns Scotus, prays to understand how God is the source of all order in creation. In his work, The Treatise on the First Principle, Scotus seeks to demonstrate what exactly order is, what the various kinds of order are, and how this can be used to demonstrate the existence of God. The concept of order has also become very relevant in modern science. One of the most important concepts in modern physics is entropy. Entropy is often referred to as the measure of the disorder of a system. All systems move over time from order to disorder. However, there is no agreed upon definition in modern science of what exactly it means for a thing to be ordered or disordered. This essay will show how Scotus's metaphysics of order might provide a helpful tool for more carefully understanding the nature of entropy. Furthermore, once entropy is connected to the metaphysics of order, the science of entropy can serve as a source of fruitful spiritual meditation in understanding the relationship of God to creation, as well as the right ordering of our own souls. And so part one, the science of entropy. Entropy is a central concept in modern physics. There are rigorous mathematical definitions of entropy. However, it is very difficult to define qualitatively. For example, in A Student's Guide to Entropy, Don S. Lemon never defines entropy. Instead, he offers 5 concepts related to entropy to try and give an intuition for what entropy is. Stephen and Catherine Blundell, on the other hand, declined to give any qualitative descriptions of entropy in their textbook, Concepts in Thermal Physics, instead opting to merely give a mathematical formula. Similar issues can be found all throughout the scientific literature on entropy. There are 2 general ways to mathematically define entropy. The thermodynamic formula was introduced by Rudolf Clausius, who coined the word entropy from the Greek words en, meaning in, and trophe, meaning change. Drawing on the earlier work by Sadi Carnot and James Joule, Clausius showed that while the amount of energy in a closed system never changes, the amount of useful energy, that is, energy that can be used to do some work, always decreases. The change in entropy, then, was the measure of the amount of useful energy that has changed into non-useful energy. 12 years after Clausius coined the word entropy, Ludwig Boltzmann proposed an alternative understanding of entropy. Boltzmann introduced the statistical mechanics approach to entropy. According to Boltzmann, all things are composed of little tiny particles called atoms. These atoms could be in any number of random states. However, at a microscopic level that at the macroscopic level that humans can see, large collections of these random states appear to be the same. So these are called a microstate and a macrostate, respectively. The macro states that are more quote-unquote ordered are less statistically likely to come about by random chance because there are less microstates corresponding to them. And so an ordered state is very likely to move into a disordered state, but the opposite is statistically impossible. As an example, consider a deck of cards. If I shuffle a new deck of cards many times, there is nothing stopping me from getting lucky and just happening to get all the cards organized perfectly by suit and number. However, there is less than a 1 in 10 to the 67th chance of this happening. By comparison, this is 10 to the 60th times less likely than getting struck by lightning twice. It is important to note that the random ordering of cards you do get is just as unlikely as the perfect ordering. The cards have to end up in some order. However, all the various random orderings of cards appear more or less the same to us, and they are grouped into a large macro state, namely a random ordering, which together is very likely. Boltzmann applied the same reasoning to the order of systems made up by atoms. If you place a hot bar of metal next to a cold one, there is nothing stopping the hot bar from getting even hotter and the cold bar from getting even colder, according to Boltzmann. However, as the heat begins to be randomly distributed between the two bars, they will necessarily tend towards the same temperature by the law of statistics. Boltzmann's statistical approach to entropy is the general way entropy is now approached. Using this approach, entropy is not merely about temperature. Rather, it is about the increasing disorder of things in the universe. While order can be increased in one area, it cannot be done so without decreasing order a greater amount somewhere else. An issue remains at the heart of the statistical mechanics approach to entropy, though, namely what exactly constitutes a macrostate. Certain things seem like macrostates to us, but if all that really exists is microscopic particles, macrostates are not really different at the most basic level, and this actually has very significant implications within science. For example, shortly after Boltzmann, Henri Poincaré demonstrated that in a bounded and eternal universe, every existing arrangement of particles will necessarily recur in the future. And thus, while entropy always seems to increase, it must decrease again at some point in the future to return to the current low entropy. In recent years, Sabine Hossenfelder has argued that we should not even use the second law of thermodynamics to make cosmological claims, as entropy does not really exist. While Poincaré and Hossenfelder are consistently following through on the implications of Boltzmann's interpretation, we nonetheless see the effects of entropy quite clearly, even at these cosmological scales. It seems that order and macrostates are real features of the world, not just apparent phenomena. While Boltzmann's mathematical physics is certainly correct, I think a deeper metaphysical explanation of entropy is necessary. On part 2, the metaphysics of order. Understanding order has been an important topic in philosophy since its earliest days. For example, in his work The Republic, Plato presents justice as the proper ordering of the parts of the soul and the various parts of the city. In the Timaeus, Plato extends this out into a cosmic harmony where all the various parts of nature are properly ordered. Similar ideas can be found in Aristotle and really in the whole tradition after them. One of the most developed accounts of the metaphysics of order in the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition comes from the medieval philosopher and theologian Blessed John Duns Scotus. So in his work I quoted earlier, the treatise on the first principle, Scotus defines order as, quote, a relation of comparison said of the prior with respect to the posterior, and the posterior with respect to the prior, or in which the prior and posterior fully divide that which is ordered. So it basically means that order is some sort of relationship between the prior and posterior. So Scotus then goes on to draw distinctions between different types of orders. The most fundamental distinction is between an essentially and accidentally ordered series. So in an essentially ordered series, the posterior depends upon the prior for its essence, that is, what the thing is. Whereas in an accidentally ordered series, the posterior is affected by the prior, but in a way that is not essential. So it changes a thing in a certain way, but does not change essentially what it is. It doesn't depend for its existence on the prior. Then Scotus then goes on to divide an essential order into 6 types. So he has eminence, which is the degree of perfection of a thing. a non-causal dependence. And the example he gives is the reliance of an accident on a substance, as well as he divides Aristotle's four causes. So efficient, final, material, and formal. So of particular interest for understanding entropy is Scotus's understanding of the orders of formal and material causality. So Scotus, following Aristotle, understands form to be the principle of act in a thing, and matter to be the principle of potency. He has a slightly different understanding of it than a lot of other people in the tradition, but that's not too relevant here. So that is, matter can be formed into any sort of thing, and the form causes the matter to be formed. So together, form and matter cause a thing which neither alone can account for, and that's the substance. So in the production of a new substance, an essential order obtains between the four causes. So the final cause motivates the efficient cause, which then acts upon the material cause to adduce the substantial form. And likewise, in the existence of a substance, an essential order likewise obtains, but in this order, form acts upon matter to cause a particular substance. And so this distinction is actually quite important. So in the order of being, form is prior to matter, as form causes the matter to be a matter of a substance, whereas in the order of generation, form is adduced from the potency of matter. One way Scotus's account of hylomorphism differs from Aristotle's is that Scotus allows a plurality of substantial forms within a substance. So whereas for Aristotle, the various organs of an animal are integral accidental parts, Scotus argues that they are substances, even if they exist within the larger substance of a whole organism. And this work speaks of his metaphysics of essential order. Substances can be essentially ordered to higher forms as part of the order of material causality. And Scotus only argues for this position in the context of animal organs. For inanimate substance, Scotus follows the general tradition that these parts only have a virtual existence. That is, the parts remain in their powers, but not as integral parts, like my hand would remain as part of my body. Interestingly, though, in one of his last works, the Quadlibital Questions, Scotus refers to a drop of water as an integral part of a larger body of water. So perhaps he was moving towards a pluriformity with inanimate objects, but he never elaborates on this. So one other category of essential order will be necessary for the metaphysics of entropy. So the order of eminence, that is perfection, requires that the less perfect cannot cause the more perfect. And so Scotus basically takes us as self-evident that a thing cannot cause what it does not have. So using all the various kinds of orders, Scotus argues that the universe is deeply interrelated. So in his work, The Ordinatio, which is his main theological work, Scotus says, quote, "The unity of the universe exists in the order of the parts to each other and to the first thing, that is God, as the unity of an army exists in the order of the parts of the army to each other and to the leader. And from this it can be asserted, against those who deny that a relation is a thing outside the act of the intellect, the words of the philosopher Aristotle, that the sort of people who speak thus are disconnecting the substance of the universe." Right. So essentially, God stands at the head of all things, as the most eminent, the first efficient cause, and the first final cause. All other things exist somewhere in this great interconnected web of beings, which God has created. So part 3, the metaphysics of entropy. So we now have two ways of conceiving of order. According to the field of statistical mechanics, order is a low amount of statistical randomness. Entropy causes statistical randomness to increase. According to Scotus, order is a metaphysical relationship between prior and posterior. It may seem then that they are using the word order equivocally. However, entropy can be interpreted through Scotus's metaphysics. The key problem with the statistical mechanics definition of entropy is that there is no way to define a macrostate if microphysical reductionism is true. And this is not something unimportant. The formula for calculating entropy is the calculation of the number of microstates per macrostate. So entropy really only makes sense at all if there is such a thing as macrostates. And so hylomorphism, that form-matter relationship, can provide a way to account for the existence of macrostates. Certain properties, such as temperature, entropy, and life, cannot be accounted for through microstates. So considering only vibrations in quantum fields, which would sort of be the most fundamental view in modern physics, a lizard and a rock would really look more or less the same. However, from a macroscopic perspective, the two are very different. This is what scientists call emergence. Understanding emergence in terms of hylomorphism, what emerges is precisely a new substantial form. In emergence, a new substance really comes to be. The arrangement of particles adduces a substantial form, and this substantial form now orders the arrangement of its parts. The motion of the parts is now most easily explained by these macroscopic properties. This has been called downward causality. The upward material causality and the downward formal cause both exert effects upon the substance, which cannot be explained without both of them. These causes are not external things acting upon the substance, but intrinsic principles within the substance. Thus, one should not expect to discover some new substance called form, which can be studied independently in the laboratory. Rather, form is discovered through its presence in substances. The one advantage I think that Scotus's account of hylomorphism has over the standard Aristotelian account is that pluriformity I was talking about. So one contemporary defender of hylomorphism, in light of emergence, for example, Robert Kuhns, argues that the molecules in a substance exist only virtually. However, it does not seem that the molecules in a substance exist only through some sort of power. They really exist, I think, as integral parts, like a hand exists as part of a body. However, picking up on the hint in the quadlibital questions, in light of modern science, Scotus's pluriformity can be extended to include a pluriformism within inanimate substances. In the case of a bucket of water, for example, each molecule of H2O has a substantial form. When all these molecules come together in a bucket, they exhibit macroscopic properties, such as temperature, pressure, and other properties, that come about through the adduction and reception of the additional substantial form of the body of water. I do think there is still room for the concept of virtual existence. So subatomic particles exhibit certain indeterminate properties, which I talked about in my last talk for this conference series. Fits in sort of with what we understand to work with a state of potency, which seems not to be able, according to Scotus, to be held by a substance. Furthermore, when atoms are present in a molecule, they seem to lose the powers they had as independent atoms. So the former of these, I think, is a virtual existence, and I think the latter likely is as well. Thus, when various subatomic particles come together to make hydrogen and oxygen, then these hydrogen and oxygen come together to make H2O. Their substantial forms are actually corrupted and replaced with new ones, whereas when H2O molecules come together to make a body of water, their substantial forms merely come to be ordered to a higher form. A twofold ordering exists then in a macroscopic substance. There is first the ordering of the material particles in microscopic substantial forms causing molecular substances. There is then the ordering of the material molecules in the macroscopic substantial form, causing the macroscopic substance. There are distinct scientific laws explaining the interactions between these things at distinct levels. So the quantum for virtual particles, chemistry for molecules, and other sciences for different aspects of macroscopic substances. So statistical mechanics studies the ordering between the macroscopic and the microscopic. So potency is always a potential ordered to some act, according to Scotus. So we perceive macroscopic substances, and through them we can grasp a certain amount of information about the arrangement of the microscopic particles within them. The more well-ordered a substance is, the more that can be grasped about its microscopic arrangement. One important principle of hylomorphism is that all hylomorphic entities tend towards corruption. This is the tendency of all things to move through towards disorder through entropy. As a substance becomes disordered, it becomes more and more corrupted. This applies to other orders as well. So Scotus refers to virtue as the harmony of the faculties of the soul. And so, given entropy, it seems mankind, considered as a whole species, is inevitably doomed to moral disorder. Scotus likewise refers to the state as a unity of order, and so over time, all civilizations then would tend towards collapse. Furthermore, over time, the order of the natural world tends towards collapse too. This is the movement of the whole universe towards heat death. Left on its own, all order will eventually disintegrate. While things can order other things, because of the essential order of eminence, something cannot create something more perfect than itself. Phrased in terms of modern science, something cannot decrease the entropy of one system without raising the entropy of another by a greater amount. The solution to this constant disordering of the universe, then, cannot be found within the universe itself. Something greater is needed. And turn to part 4, theological implications. Entropy, from a strictly philosophical perspective, leaves one quite hopeless. The universe is headed for complete disorder, and there is nothing that can be done to stop it. However, Scotus was not merely a philosopher, but a theologian. For Scotus, while philosophy and theology are distinct, man is ordered to a theological destiny. So philosophy will always need theology to complete it, and theology will always need philosophy for its tools. In fact, Scotus is actually quite insistent that he does not consider himself a philosophus, but a theologicus. It is in light of this Christian hope, I think, that one can find a solution to the despair of entropy. While God is exempt from the order of entropy as he is not physical, Scotus does insist that God has a transcendental relation of essential order with the creation. And this is because Scotus considers essential order to be what he calls a disjunctive transcendental. And so he actually argues it can be applied univocally to God. This is probably the most controversial aspect of Scotus's metaphysics. So God is most perfect, and so we must always be at the more perfect side of every disjunct, the prior. So nonetheless, we can really speak of order in God, even if he's always going to be the prior in every order. So thus, the lessons learned about order from entropy can in some sense be applied to God, but we have to strip away any aspects of limitation and physicality. So God, as most eminent, must be perfectly ordered. If order is thought of in terms of the relationship between macrostate and microstate, I actually think this makes perfect sense in light of divine simplicity. God cannot be other than he is. No matter what God does, he always remains perfectly ordered. As infinite, God's order can never be exhausted. And so while other things can only order one thing by decreasing the order of another, God can order without in any way becoming disordered. Interestingly, a study by Scott Aronson, Sean Carroll, and Lauren Willett showed that systems in both a low and high states of entropy tend to be simple, whereas systems in the middle tend to be complex. Hence, God is perfectly ordered, and pure act is perfectly simple, although in a very different sort of way of simplicity than the entirely disordered state of potency. All created beings, as a composite of act and potency, must be complex. So, before the fall, man was placed in a state of supernatural relationship with God. Thus, in the Garden of Eden, while nature had the same physical laws and so on its own tended towards disorder, man was constantly supernaturally restored to order. By tilling and keeping the garden, man was called to be the source of the ordering of the whole cosmos. In the fall, man cut himself off from the supernatural source of his order. However, through the incarnation, God orders a human nature to the divine nature in the unity of a single person. The incarnation thus provides a source of order for the whole cosmos. St. Bonaventure, another Franciscan theologian shortly before Scotus, and whose works deeply influenced Scotus, refers to the grace of Christ as hierarchizing, that is, ordering our soul. The church serves as a source of supernatural order in the world, naturally tending towards disorder. That is, the church is a source of supernatural order, and the world is naturally tending towards disorder. Of course, all of this goes beyond the physics of entropy. So even if modern physics, I think, it turned out to be very different, there would be good, I think, philosophical grounds for Scotus's metaphysics of entropy, and good theological grounds for the source of Christ as the new order of creation. Entropy, though, I think, shows a manifestation of this principle within modern physics. Furthermore, entropy now gives us a physical example of metaphysical order. And so perhaps metaphysicians, I think, can actually even use this example when teaching Scotus's treatise on the first principle. And so this is only a preliminary study. It seems, I think, that metaphysicians and scientists could benefit from a mutual dialogue about the nature of entropy. And so I hope this essay serves as an inspiration for continued research in this field. And so thank you everyone for listening and looking forward to questions.
Gideon, thank you for that. That was absolutely fascinating, and a completely new way of looking, for me at least, at entropy. So thank you. I haven't got any questions in the chat at the moment, but I'm hoping that someone may have some questions and is ready to pose them to Gideon at the moment. Scott, it looks like, has his hand up. So Scott, over to you with your first question.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And thank you so much, Gideon, for your presentation. I wanted to maybe raise a couple of objections that I had to your paper. I'd be really curious to hear how you respond to them in the spirit of the dialogue you were kind of talking about, right? So the first one is in the discussion of Scotus, there seems to be some sort of equating between something like harmony and goodness, and then disorder and corruption. But I'm curious about, it seems to be the case that those concepts come apart. I mean, come apart pretty strongly. I mean, just as an example, you can imagine a very orderly, evil empire, right? One which, has quite a bit of mastery over the entropic dynamics of, its environment and is able to maintain, the parameters that it's set to maintain, but which, continuously does incredibly cruel, violent and terrible things to people, or, committing other sorts of, moral atrocities that don't entail things like violence or death, things that don't entail the dissolution of systems. So I'll start with that one, and I actually have to step away for 2 seconds, but I'll be able to hear you. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, this is, I think, a very important question. And I think this is important that the word good can be used in many ways. So one example that comes to the top of my mind that Thomas Aquinas gives is the example of what does it mean when we call someone a good thief? Because strictly speaking, right, theft is not good. When we call someone a good thief, we're saying that they are skilled and able to do that, but that's still some manifestation of goodness, but it's a sort of disordered goodness. So I'd say in the case of sort of the well-ordered evil empire, the problem with it is not that it's well-ordered. The problem is that it's evil, right? And it could even be, I think, that it's actually, it might appear ordered, right? You have different parts of the empire ordered to each other. But I think Scotus would actually say, as a whole, it's actually disordered, because part of that order of the universe is the ordering of things to God. And so by being morally evil, then, it would be disordering itself from the moral order and away from God. And so actually, it would be almost more bad than if it was just disorder entirely, because it's taking this good order and then disordering the whole thing, which is going to draw all the parts away as well.
So is there, if you don't mind me asking a follow-up, is there, I guess the thing that I'm wondering is there some sort of, problem where, we're identifying a moral order with God, and then also a structural order with God, but then structural order can come apart from that good order. So then I guess what work it's done by associating both the moral order and the physical, structural, entropic order with the divine.
Yeah, and so that's what I'm trying to look at here is essentially is not that entropy equals what Scotus was talking about with order, but that this might be one manifestation of a much larger principle. And my main concern really is not so much entropy. I'm a theology student, so I'm very interested in applying the metaphysics of order to theological and ethical problems. And so I want to say, can we given modern science, do we have to abandon the inclusion of order within the physical order and say, all right, this is just a theological and ethical principle? Or can we say, no, it also extends to the physical order, even if our scientific understanding of how that might be a little bit different from how the medievals understood it? And I want to say that this principle of order is manifested in one way in entropy.
That's brilliant. I think Ellen has got a question for you to follow on. So Ellen, over to you.
Thank you. That was a very rich paper, I thought. I wanted to ask if you had considered anything about process theology and order and chaos in those kinds of terms, because a predominant idea in process theology is that God lures creation from chaos to order. So there's almost a moral dimension to it, where immoral action is that which increases the amount of order in the world, and moral action is that which decreases the amount of disorder in the world, although they use slightly different terminology. So yeah, I was wondering what you if you had thought about that, or if you had anything to say about that.
No, thank you for that. It gives me, I think, a new research area to look into. My training is really primarily in sort of ancient and medieval philosophy and theology, so I'm actually honestly just not too familiar with a lot of modern authors. I tend to only look at modern authors when they come up in the secondary literature, because that's just not my areas of research. But I would like to further dialogue, I think, with developments in modern philosophy and theology. So thank you for giving me that new direction to look into.
Brilliant, thank you. Are there any other questions from anyone else for Gideon? Oh, Gavin has his hand up. Gavin, over to you.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
You can indeed.
I'm a mathematician. The interesting issue of form and matter, which you raised, and substance, I suppose, emerges in a kind of abstract mathematics, because you see all these structures emerging in many different mathematical theories, and then someone sees the commonality and they invent a form, and that's how group theory came into being, for example, or topological spaces, all sorts of such things, where the abstract space finds the form and then leaves all, I don't know if I'm using it in a very different way, but the matter gets left behind, and then we study the form and we do theorems. And we don't even, you might mention the applications at the end, but the matter has gone and the form is everything. Now you said something quite interesting, which I would like you, this is my question, I suppose, to elaborate on, where you said form is discoverable through its presence in substances. Now I read that mathematically. No one saw the form in these abstract mathematical structures before many substances in various real mathematical theories had been first observed, and then the form is discovered, and then it is named, and then it's run away with. And sometimes the matter is left behind, and there are people who object. Where's the matter? What's the point? Why are you off in the abstract world with no... It's an interesting phenomenon in maths. Mathematicians don't talk about form and matter, but I think they should more, and I wonder what we can learn from you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I agree that I'm freezing up here a minute. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay. And plus my screen froze up for a sec. All right. So yeah, I definitely agree that mathematics, I think, can benefit, I think, very much from a dialogue with this approach of hylomorphism. There's an interesting book that began to touch on this a bit by a philosopher of mathematics named James Franklin. And he has an interesting discussion at the beginning, because traditionally Aristotelians classified mathematics as the study of quantity. But he points out that no, mathematics, since really the time of Euler, has shifted really more almost to a discussion of patterns and structure as a more fundamental principle than quantity.
Yep.
And that seems to me right. And it's interesting when Scotus is discussing the breakdown of the Aristotelian, what he calls real sciences. So there's discussion of essentially physics, metaphysics, and mathematics. He's not entirely happy with the traditional definitions of what each of these subjects is about. And he doesn't, beyond this, really discuss what mathematics is about too much. But I actually think this idea of structure is a very good principle to latch onto as what mathematics is fundamentally about. And I think there could be a very interesting dialogue as well with Scotus and mathematics, because he's very interested actually in applying some parts of Euclid's elements to discussions of angelic motion. And he's also interested in these discussions of infinity in mathematics when he's discussing God. And so I haven't pulled together all the different elements, but that's definitely an area I'd like to continue doing research in. I do actually have a sort of short paper I wrote up mostly for myself to put down some thoughts on paper of how set theory actually seems to me to sort of work like hylomorphism. So you have the matter of all these different things in the set, and then the form unifies all those different elements, those material elements, into a single set. And interestingly, then there's the whole question in mathematics of what do we count as actually numerically one? And Scotus has long discussions of the nature of unity, both as a numerical unity and then also he thinks of as a less than numerical unity. So when he's describing the common natures of things, he thinks of that as a less than numerical unity. So we all share one human nature, but it seems to have a less than numerical unity. And he wants that because we are numerically many. And he wants to contrast that with the Trinity, with while there are three persons in the Trinity, their nature is actually numerically one. Whereas our nature, even though it's a common nature, just like the Trinity shares a common nature, our nature has this less than numerical unity. And that'll actually be directly, one of, not his direct student, but probably a student of his students, was William of Ockham, sort of the great nominalist. And this is going to be where he goes after Scotus. He's going to argue this idea of a common nature with a less than numerical unity doesn't make any sense at all. I obviously do think that it does make sense and has a lot of importance. And I actually do think that this mathematical approach can be a useful way to show this existence of common nature.
Thank you very much. Can I add to that question?
Absolutely.
The word structure goes with the word causality or entropy or order. And scientists and mathematicians think of these things in very precise terms as carefully framed definitions within abstract theories, essentially models of reality. Now you have, I think you described your hope as to make some application of ideas like order and entropy to theology and ethics. And we might encounter the same problem, do we? Such as came up in the last session where someone questioned the idea of causality within science, the physical universe, and causality involving God, which is something utterly and completely different. And we have to be careful about that. So is there something you can say about how you would begin to apply such scientific terms as order, structure, coherence, causality, entropy, in theological or ethical terms?
Yeah, so unfortunately, since I'm in America here, it's very early morning, so I wasn't able to make it to the earlier talk, but I can talk generally about how Scotus approaches this. This is actually sort of the area that Scotus is probably most well known for, is his discussion of how we speak about God. Because Scotus is very concerned with his teacher's view, which is Henry of Ghent. And Henry of Ghent's view, essentially, is that God and creation are so fundamentally different that we can't actually really even use a word in any sense the same way. He says all language of God is really equivocal. And God creates within our mind this sort of common concept of God and creation, but it's not really common to either one. And Scotus thinks this is terrible. This is going to destroy all of theology. And Scotus sort of infamously defends the univocity of language between us and God. But he wants to be very careful on how he defines that, because he's not saying that the earlier discussion of the analogy of being was wrong. He's actually very stringent to defend, no, analogy is true. But we have to ask fundamentally, what do we actually mean when we're speaking of analogy? And so Scotus wants to say that in order for a syllogism about God to be valid, there has to be some component of that syllogism which is univocal in order for that logical validity to hold. And so Scotus develops upon this medieval idea of the transcendentals. So this idea that was developing in the Middle Ages. There's a great book on this by Jan Ertzen on the history of the transcendentals in the Middle Ages. And this idea is that certain notions we use of both God and creation, such as being, goodness, truth, unity. There was a question of how are we using these terms? So this idea that there's these things that transcend Aristotle's categories. So Aristotle has these 10 categories famously. And medieval theologians want to say those only apply to created things. God is outside of the 10 categories. But also there's these transcendentals that seem to be applicable, both the things in the categories and to God. And so they transcend the categories. And Scotus really develops upon this and comes up with all sorts of new types of transcendentals as well to explain things. And the most important one really is this idea of the disjunctive transcendentals, that there are certain things that apply to all being, but not on its own, but as sort of a pairing of two things. So with order, his example is prior and posterior, right? Everything is either prior or posterior in some respect. And nothing escapes that ordering of priority and posteriority. But when you apply it to something, it's either going to be prior or posterior in whatever respect. And so God has this sort of absolute priority to all things, as both its cause and as its source of perfection. But Scotus wants to say, and this is really controversial, is that no, God really is part of that order. He's not dependent upon the order at all, because it's only the posterior thing that's in any way dependent. So he's not saying that that God is dependent upon us, or that the sort of way God is ordered to creation is the same way things in creation are ordered to one another. God is entirely different from creation, but in such a way that there is these sort of basic transcendental commonalities through which then we can understand God. And so then if we're going to take something like entropy and we say, right, this is an instantiation of order, we then have to work through very carefully what aspects of that are connected to order as such, and which aspects are connected to the fact that it's physical, and it's related to entropy. And it's only those aspects that are connected to order as such that can then be taken and applied to other areas, because order is this transcendental notion that's going to apply to all sorts of different areas.
Thank you. That's a very impressive explanation. Thank you very much.
If you're interested in this issue of the transcendentals in Scotus, there's a great study on this by Alan Walter called The Transcendentals and Their Function in the Metaphysics of Duns Scotus. And it's actually on archive.org. I know archive's down right now, but if you can access it through there, you can read it on there. And unfortunately, I think if you encounter Scotus a lot in non-experts in the field, they'll often misrepresent this. And they'll say, Thomas Aquinas thought we speak of God in analogy, then Scotus introduces this modern way of speaking of God univocally. And Scotus is not saying univocity in the way that's often meant nowadays when we say univocity. He means univocity in only a logical sense, that we have this linguistic univocity that has to hold in order for logical validity. But he's very insistent that we still have to speak of God analogically in terms of metaphysics.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Gideon, for that. I found that absolutely fascinating. We are absolutely out of time. It has left me, I have to say, Gideon, wondering how one properly orders the soul, but a question maybe for another time. But thank you for that. Thank you for the questions from the panel this afternoon. I think we're going to be brought back into the main meeting just to finish off this afternoon. But thank you, Gideon, and a round of applause as ever virtually for such an exceptional presentation. So thank you.
I'm going to have the paper up on my academia page later today if anyone's interested in looking at it, looking at the citations and so on. So
fantastic. Thank you.